Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the second lecture in the Royal Armouries 2024 Summer Lecture Series. I'm Mark Bennett, I'm the Museum's Research Manager. Thank you for joining us today. The Royal Armouries is the UK's national collection of arms and armour, which began life as a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London. We now operate from three sites: our historic home at the Tower, the main museum at Leeds, from where we join you today, and Fort Nelson outside Portsmouth, where we keep the bulk of our artillery collection. Whether you're available to join us in person or not, we have even more lectures coming up. You can attend these either online or in our museum in Leeds, as well as these will also be available to watch again through our YouTube channel if you're not able to make them at the time. They run through August and they will showcase the latest research from current doctoral students. After today's event, we'll be looking at siege warfare in the medieval Levant and British military families in the Napoleonic Wars. Following that, we'll have a brand new winter lecture series for you in autumn 2024. On some technical matters, after today's talk, we will be taking questions from the Zoom Q&A function, the YouTube chat, and from people here in the audience. If you are submitting them online, send them in as soon as they occur to you, please. I can't guarantee to get through them all. I can't guarantee to cover the most popular ones, but we'll do the best we can to get through them. On some technical matters, you can also add captions if you're hard of hearing. Unfortunately, people here in the audience are going to have to suffer with my atrocious Yorkshire accent and Adam's much more pleasant American one. But if you are hard of hearing, there is a CC button at the bottom of the screen in both Zoom and YouTube. We also have the option to send us feedback after the talk. You should be able to scan the QR code by pausing the slides, or I will put a link in the chat in Zoom and another one will come out on YouTube. If you can take a minute or two to let us know what you think, it will be very greatly appreciated. So with all those technical factors out of the way, let me introduce today's topic. The museum spends a lot of time understanding and explaining the technical and practical factors behind arms and armour throughout history. However, an equally important component of that is the human side of arms and armour, how carrying them and how using them affects people, whether that's feelings of self-esteem or feelings of guilt. Now, you may remember in the previous summer lecture series, we had a talk on Roman and barbarian tactics. Today's talk helps to fill that out a little by considering how the Romans processed the sort of violent events that we've seen previously. And to take us through a very difficult topic is Adam Aderman, who is completing his PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University. We have in fact dragged him away from his writing up, which I understand is going very well. Very grateful to him for taking the time to look at this topic. So without any further ado, over to you, Adam.
Thank you. Can we get the slides?
Yes.
While he is doing that, I'd first like to start by thanking everyone for coming to my presentation, Psychological Trauma in the Roman Empire, which focuses on my PhD research. I would also like to thank Dr. Bennett and the Royal Armouries for their invitation for me to speak at the museum here in Leeds. I am deeply honored to present at this fantastic museum, which has a rich array of artifacts for you to see. And for those of you online, the museum does offer an abundance of online resources and collections for you to see through their digitized collection. My research revisits experiences of and responses to trauma among auxiliary and legionary soldiers of the Roman army. My work builds on relatively recent directions and studies of both ancient trauma and lived experiences of Roman soldiers, with a fresh and holistic approach to how soldiers experienced what can be considered trauma and in what ways their circumstances shaped such experiences. I take a broad approach to exploring their lives, cultures, emotional lives, and even their sensory experiences in the Roman army and the extent of legal, social, and military expectations on and of them. For the topic of my talk this afternoon, though, I will focus on one particular aspect of this research, which is the textual and literary accounts of their experience of battle and how we can use these to approach an understanding of trauma as a consequence to combat. Before I continue, I do want to give a few content warnings. My research involves descriptions of dying, death, and also violent deaths. There are hints of cannibalism and a mention of suicide, so audience discretion is thus advised. I split my talk into three sections. So first, we will look at the modern understandings of trauma. This is to give us all a similar frame of reference when I say the word trauma, but to also dive a bit deeper into the direction my research comes from, the modern psychological foundations of understanding trauma through culture. Next, we will look at the ancient perspective, but specifically Roman culture, and what I mean whenever I say Roman culture and how broad this actually is. Finally, we will look at the experiences based on two people's accounts, Julius Caesar and Flavius Josephus. Now we will take a look at the first section of the talk, the modern outlook, to understand what trauma is and what I mean by this umbrella term of culture. So, what is trauma? Oh, there we go. So what is trauma? Is it a physical wound or physical damage to the body? Or is it a mentally damaging experience? Is it all of the above? For a moment, let me turn your attention to a psychiatric book used by the Western world, at the very least in the US and in the UK, for mental health related inquiries, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition text revision, which will be referred to from now on as the DSM-5-TR, and it was published in March of 2022 by the American Psychiatric Association. Interestingly enough, this book and its 1,139 pages does not define the word trauma or traumatic. The DSM-5 does provide differences in symptoms which may delineate or imply traumatic events. In trauma and stressor-related events, the DSM-5-TR states, and I quote, "It is clear, however, that many individuals who have been exposed to a traumatic or stressful event exhibit a phenotype in which, rather than anxiety or fear-based symptoms, the most prominent clinical characteristics are anhedonic or inability to feel pleasure, and dysphoric symptoms, externalizing angry and aggressive symptoms, or dissociative symptoms," end quote. This means that there is no list of events for us to look for. Rather, it is the reaction to these events that matter. To dive further into that, do you think what people perceive as traumatic can be explained differently by different cultures? Or more specifically, that different cultures can go through the same event and walk away with different experiences? The simple answer is yes. People can witness an event and walk away with different memories. Some may be traumatized for a while. Some may be traumatized for life. Others may walk away the entirely opposite. They can continue their day as normal. The concept of trauma is different between most people and even those of the same or like culture groups. The emphasis on formulating the subject's culture is paramount as it underpins the entirety of understanding mental health. Through the DSM-5-TR, we can try to gain an understanding of mental health in the ancient world. And though the DSM-5-TR is by no means clear and without error, it certainly helps with a starting point for researchers and practitioners in mental health. This broad model of understanding culture and trauma is one which I refer to frequently in my own research. It is not intended to simply replace a model of PTSD. After all, it is a model still based in modern circumstances. However, we can better use this as a heuristic device to help us explore various aspects of experienced trauma. And rather than placing a diagnosis on people of the past, we can use it to simply raise questions and find links. Unlike PTSD, it was not conceived of and developed with therapeutic methods in mind, nor was it based on the specifics of one particular context, the Vietnam War. As such, it gives us a much more open and general set of avenues in human psychiatry to explore when it comes to understanding the impacts of trauma. Firstly, I keep saying culture, but what precisely do I mean by that? Well, that is partly what this cultural formulation is for, to determine what aspects we should consider when we are trying to understand someone's trauma. Therefore, we must understand the subject, which includes garnering a sense of the subject's identity, but in a way that the subject themselves describes. In addition to this, social factors come into play, such as religion, family, and access to wider social spheres. Economic status also plays a role, as wealth can affect access to resources, power structures, and overall attainment of goods and services. Finally, language plays one of the most vital roles as it helps determine how the subject themselves conveys their own emotions, such as idioms of distress, or as I put on the slide, the concept of distress. This language can help show how a particular person constructs using their cultural background, trauma, and distress. As such, how can we understand trauma better? From here, we have some obstacles to overcome. The DSM-5-TR is arguably the most helpful guide for trying to understand mental health-related inquiries. Even looking at trauma through a PTSD lens can provide more insight into people's lives. However, it does create issues when we attempt to map modern experiences onto ancient ones. To fully understand the complex nature of this, I want to describe PTSD from the DSM-5-TR very briefly. This disorder is characterized by a myriad of symptoms followed by direct exposure to an event, although there are a few exceptions to this, including fear-based re-experiencing or emotional, behavioral, arousal, reactive externalizing, or dissociative symptoms. The core part of PTSD lies within embedded memories, which trigger negative responses included in the symptom list I just mentioned, and avoidance of certain things related to the event, negative moods, and all of these all last more than 1 month after the event, though PTSD is much more complex than this. Recently pointed out very well by Owen Rees in a new volume on combat trauma in the pre-modern world, it is this final attribute of duration, 1 month, is where most, if not all, PTSD and antiquity debates fall apart, as we primarily only have snapshots of an individual's history, not long-standing accounts of their lives post-war. The circumstances of war and the cultures of people are dissimilar enough to warrant an investigation rather than a mapping of experiences. Furthermore, utilizing the DSM-5-TR is not without reservation, as there is no therapeutic element to the research. As with many areas of study in the mental health field, there are understandably elements of recourse to the frameworks they have. Trauma is, as I previously mentioned, much more broad than that. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that we first need to understand trauma from the context of Roman soldiers' lives and take a more holistic approach to ancient texts and sources. To do that, we will, as I mentioned previously, look at 2 ancient sources and accounts from these books. The first book is one that I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in reading Julius Caesar's work, called The Landmark Julius Caesar, which is edited and translated by a scholar by the name of Kurt Raflab. You can be an expert or a novice in Roman history and still gain something from this book. The other book is called Josephus, the Jewish War, books 4 through 7 from the Loeb Classical Library. This is an old translation, and there are newer ones available, but this is one that had Greek next to it, so it's the one that I use. So who are these ancient authors? The first is Julius Caesar, probably the one of these 2 pictured that most of you have heard of. He was a general in the Roman Republic who turned into a dictator before being assassinated in 44 BCE. He wrote about his time as a general during Rome's incursion into Gaul. Though he covers mostly military affairs, Caesar does keep track of and sometimes speak on behalf of many of the tribes in Gaul. The second author is Flavius Josephus, who was born in Jerusalem and was a Jewish man of elite status. When the Jewish people rebelled in 66 CE, he became a general in their army and, as such, fought against the Romans. In 67, the Romans besieged Jotapata, the town Josephus was in, and the Romans won. Josephus surrenders, but also defects to the Roman side. When the Romans besieged Jerusalem in 70, Josephus acts as a liaison between the Romans and the Jewish community and leadership within the city. His writings are much more descriptive and provide a richer array of detail than Caesar's. Both authors are not without their flaws, and there is a lot of scholarship out there that talks about the influences upon these writers, but it is clear that both are writing for a purpose and to persuade their audience. So now we move to the second part of the talk, where we look at the ancient perspectives, but specifically looking at Roman culture. So when we say Roman Empire, it sort of seems a bit misleading, as if everyone in the empire was Roman, ascribed to Roman ideals, or were culturally Roman. This map shows the range of the empire from the time of the first Roman emperor's death in CE 14, though it would take another 100 years or so for the empire to reach its greatest physical extent, which I'll show in the next slide. I mention this only to outline the vast borders of the empire and to visually show its diversity. This map in particular shows where all the legions were stationed in 14 CE. To exemplify the diversity of soldiers, I want to turn our attention to a specific legion, the 10th Legio Fretensis, which is number 16 on the map, stationed in the provinces of Judea and Syria. I don't know if there's a little, yeah, here we go, right there. These were Roman citizens serving in these two provinces for extended periods of time, accompanied by auxiliaries who were from all over the empire. As cited by Paul Holder, military diplomas, which is sort of a document, if you will, given to provincial men after their 25 years of service, stating that they are now citizens and that their children and sometimes their wives were also citizens. From the year CE 86 of Domitian's reign, indicate that the auxiliary units that were also in Judea came from Thrace, which is in the center of the map, Mauritania, which is in the lower left, Lusitania, which is in modern Portugal, Egypt, which is sort of in the bottom right, and specifically Cantabria, which is a town in Spain, and Gaetuli, a town in northwest Africa. As one can imagine, the religious, social, and linguistic aspects, even family and kin structures from these various provinces were drastically different, something which has been demonstrated by April Pudsey in various publications on epigraphy and papyri from the provinces, and by Michel George on the basis of provincial funerary inscriptions. Of course, getting paid in money and land on completion of service, plus obtaining Roman citizenship for their children, was probably the real drawing feature for auxiliary soldiers. The auxiliary units were one of the few means through which a degree of social mobility could be achieved, but nevertheless, this was a large group of people from all over the empire who not only fought together, but were also guards for forts and cities, which is a predictable position for soldiers, and builders. In fact, some scholars have pointed out that the army at times allowed various towns and locales access to specialized workers who may have been too far or too expensive or otherwise completely unavailable to them. This was, after all, a large group of disciplined men who could handle the physical demands of construction and repairs. This map is probably the more famous genre of Roman Empire maps, as it's from 117, which is when the empire was at its largest physical extent. I just wanted to show this so you could visualize and see how far-ranging the cultural landscape was, and that being, quote, Roman was not so simple to define. Though Roman culture cannot be defined or described in a talk like this, I'm going to immediately backpedal on myself, and I'm going to try to define Roman culture. I do want to highlight some aspects which I did bring up at the beginning, beginning with religion. There we go. For much of the empire's time, the Romans were largely polytheistic. Their religion was not based upon morality or redemption, but their religion was used to explain the natural processes, such as why the sun rose, why crops grew. Part of their religion also focused on ceremonies and practices around honor and ancestral worship, and or paying homage to their ancestors. For people in antiquity, they were ever surrounded by their religion, and deities were merely manifestations of aspects of life. There we go. Then we have family, which was important for religion, but also formed the basis of many social and legal structures. Paterfamilias, or male head of household, was this basis and formed the core of the Roman patriarchy. It was also through family that citizens formed their names through the tria nomina, or three names. I've broken down Julius Caesar's name on the slide. So we have Gaius Julius Caesar. Oh, I'm so sorry, Caesar's cut off. Where you have a first name, which is their personal name. Their second name is the name of the tribe. And then their third name is the branch from that tribe. So Julius is from the gens of Julia. This name signified status, connections, and power within the Roman world. Other sorts of power include social orders and the like, which would delineate Roman citizens even further. This would delineate them from the rich to the poor. Some of these examples include being a senator, being an equestrian, being a veteran. These would certainly be self-ascribed characteristics, as many leave these titles on their tombstones. I know this was a rapid-fire introduction to Roman culture, but I hope it is enough to get a basis for what is to come. So now we're getting to the final section, which is the heart of my research, and probably why many of you joined this talk, to discover what Romans were saying about trauma, if they even were. I want to start with Caesar's Gallic War in Book 7 during the Siege of Alesia. This siege is sort of infamous as far as Roman military battles go. To set the stage, in the year 52 BCE, while Caesar was governor of Gaul, Vercingetorix, the leader of a Gallic rebellion, made it to the town of Alesia with Caesar hot on his trail. Vercingetorix had ordered a relief force of 258,000 men, commanded by 4 men of various tribes or nations, to aid Vercingetorix's 80,000 men who were actually walled up inside the city of Alesia. This picture, which is from the landmark Julius Caesar, again, very highly recommended, shows how Caesar made a wall to prevent people from coming in or out of Alesia, which is the circumvallation wall, which is this interior wall right here. Caesar then discovered that the relief force was coming to alleviate Vercingetorix, who knew Alesia was not prepared for a long siege. So Caesar built a second wall to protect his men, the contravallation wall, which is the exterior wall that you see here. Caesar's men were now locked between their two walls, with Alesia on the inside and the relief force on the outside of the exterior wall. It is during this time that the following series of events occur. The first quote is from Book 7, passage 78. In the passages leading up to this, Critignatus, a local tribesman who came from what we might consider as nobility, but Caesar describes as, and I quote, a very noble Arvernian family, proposed a plan to combat starvation during the course of the siege, eating those that could no longer fight. Caesar outright condemns this plan in his commentary, but he goes on to describe the beginning of the siege, in which Alesia expelled those of, and I quote, ill health, old age, or were useless as fighters, end quote. However, Caesar had other plans and intended to make the situation worse for those inside the city. As they approached the Roman fortifications, they cried and begged with all kinds of entreaties to be taken into slavery and given food. But Caesar posted guards along the top of the wall and gave strict orders not to let them enter, not to let the civilian population through the walls to escape the siege. It is unlikely Caesar knew of Critignatus's plan when he denied these people their departure, yet even if he did know, it was probably unlikely that this would have changed the outcome. The point of this blockade was to further exacerbate the conditions inside the city. Here we have some issues. Firstly, the natives of Alesia had some expectation, definitely hope, that they would be allowed to leave and be spared the effects of a siege and aftermath of a siege. It is possible, though again not likely, that the civilians knew of Critignatus's plan, possibly wishing to escape the horrors of cannibalism, but certainly wanting to escape starvation. They preferred slavery. Secondly, Caesar's denial of their departure out of Alesia meant they not only had to go back into the town, and if they knew about the plan, then knowingly face cannibalism, but it certainly meant that they would face starvation. Interestingly, Caesar made sure to tell his audience that he did not allow a civilian population to go free right after he gives us a very long speech by the enemy about how the soldiers planned to resort to cannibalism if the food situation deteriorated enough. Aside from causing less strain on the resources, what else could freeing them have done? I'm certain Caesar did not want any repercussions from this already rather precarious event, and perhaps it was more than likely that Caesar wished for any advantage. It could also merely be Caesar showing his Roman audience the barbaric nature of his enemies, that they were willing to even consider cannibalism, further justifying his own campaign against them. Regardless of the reasoning, Caesar's explicit mention of this means that there is some purpose behind it, and I argue that it was to emphasize, along with a possibly rhetorical or military goal in mind, Caesar's implication that this was an intentional action to deprive the people of Alesia, along with Vercingetorix's army, of their most basic needs, primarily food, which further harmed the psyche of the people. Now they may die from starvation, and to further worsen their mental health, possibly eaten. A starving population also means a physically weaker and a less focused population, and if Vercingetorix's words are true, then there was also an element of moral dilemma. Gallic forces soon performed several double assaults against the Roman walls. Caesar stated in 7.84, fighting broke out everywhere simultaneously. There we go. Fighting broke out everywhere simultaneously, and the Gauls attempted everything, concentrating on any points that seemed more vulnerable. With such long fortifications, the Roman force was stretched thin and had great difficulty opposing assaults at several locations at once. Shouting arose from the rear of our men, which greatly contributed to their fear, because they realized that their safety from danger depended on other men's courage. Generally, people's minds are more vehemently disturbed by threats they cannot directly confront. And this translation is again from Julius Caesar, or from the landmark Julius Caesar. This is perhaps one of the most significant quotes from my research, which comes from this last line. Generally, people's minds are more vehemently disturbed by threats they cannot directly confront. Not only was this sound coming from behind them, and they could not quite see the point of, they could not see the origin of the sound, but the men now had formal recognition that there was trouble. The extent or severity of the trouble would have been unknown to them, the listeners of the shouting, but a cry, a shout, or a shriek does often imply at least a perception of trouble. Given these were trained soldiers, it is reasonable to suggest that the shouting would certainly mean that there was an issue or problem. A break in the defense would have disastrous consequences, especially if they were stretched so thin, and as such, this sound of trouble likely reminded them of how totally dependent they were upon their fellow soldiers to defend their assigned portion of this wall. This quote echoes some previous research into psychological resiliency and the effects various types of responses have upon one's mental health. Lazarus, a professor of psychology from Berkeley, described the coping mechanism that people may have as a result to stress. Within this research, Lazarus discovered that when people are able to directly confront what is causing them stress, they are better off later on, whereas those who could not directly confront the aggressive stimulus faced a more malignant reaction. Caesar recognized something similar to Lazarus's discussion of coping mechanisms, an observation which led him to state that since his soldiers could not directly confront what was causing them fear, their minds would be negatively affected because of it. Unconfrontable threats seem to be a catalyst for emotive language from ancient authors, as we will see in the coming slides. Josephus described the rather harrowing effects of a Roman siege against his own men. To describe the background of the siege of Jotapata, the political and religious climate between Rome and Judea was becoming more and more precarious, and the tensions between the two peoples were ever increasing. In 66, the Jewish revolt began, and thus Roman rule in the area was threatened. Josephus is embroiled in a civil war and spends some time battling in small skirmishes as a commander throughout Galilee against the Romans. It was not until 67 that Josephus's command at Jotapata, which is modern-day Yodfat, ended in a defeat. It is through this siege that we will look at the same themes as Caesar, that Romans employed tactics meant to deprive people of their needs, unconfrontable threats, death that goes against culturally normative means, such as how the people fleeing Alesia expected to be let go, and a negative sensory environment like the noises and shouting from Caesar's quote. Pictured is an illustration from Bible Walks that roughly shows how Jotapata might have looked right before the siege. Josephus described the siege engines that the Romans used, which there were about 160 at the siege of Jotapata. Interestingly enough, Josephus describes the impact these stones and other weapons had on the populace, a rare look at the psychological aspect of ancient warfare. In 372 of his Jewish Wars book, Josephus wrote, "While the engines could not be seen at a great distance, and so what was thrown at them was hard to be avoided, one of those that stood around Josephus was near the wall. His head was carried away by such a stone, and his skull was flung as far as 3 furlongs, which in modern distance is 0.375 miles, which is 0.064 kilometers. The noise of the instruments themselves was very terrible. Of the same sort was that noise the dead bodies made when they were dashed against the wall. And indeed, dreadful was the clamor which these things raised in the women within the city, which was echoed back at the same time by the cries of such as were slain, while the whole space of ground whereupon they fought ran with blood, and the wall might have been ascended over by the bodies of the dead carcasses. The mountains also contributed to increase the noise by their echoes. The siege weapons themselves were loud and noisy, and this is not the first time Josephus mentions the noise from siege weaponry. It must have bothered him so that he mentioned it several times, or that the sound was so loud it was hard not to associate the sound with the description of a siege. But Josephus takes this one step further and relays to us the sounds of those dying. This description paints a much clearer image of siege warfare than Caesar does. This was more than just dying in an unexpected way, but you are literally surrounded by reminders of death. The blood that ran on the ground does not relay the other senses that go with death, such as the smell or taste in the air. This is something that written accounts cannot truly convey, and something that we must consider as we're reading these battle accounts. These do not truly express the lived experience of these people. The sensations of extreme hunger, thirst, and desperation cannot truly be communicated through written accounts. The people of Dradapada had their senses bombarded with Roman dominance and the threat thereof. The Romans besieged Jerusalem in CE 70. The image in the top left is from the Loeb Classical Library's version of Josephus's work, but this is to give you some idea of the landscape, and that there were 3 walls the Romans had to push through to get to the heart of the city. This quote takes place towards the end of the siege. The Romans have cleared the 3rd wall, which is, that's not a good picture, I'm so sorry. The 3rd wall is the most exterior wall of Jerusalem, which you can see right here. They somewhat recently gained control over the 2nd wall, which is pictured, it's this sort of dash line right here, but had yet to pierce the 1st wall, which is right here. The Romans were having issues with taking what was known as the Old Wall. So Titus, the commander and the son of the newly crowned emperor, and his war council decide to build a wall around Jerusalem to fully blockade those still left within the city. This was the result. I'm so sorry, this is a very long quote. For the Jews, along with all egress, every hope of escape was now cut off, and the famine, enlarging its maw, devoured the people by households and families. The roofs were thronged with women and babes completely exhausted. The alleys with the corpses of the aged, children and youths with swollen figures, roamed like phantoms through the marketplaces and collapsed wherever their doom overtook them. And amidst these calamities, there was neither lamentation nor wailing. Famine stifled the emotions, and with dry eyes and grinning mouths, these slowly dying victims looked on those who had gone to their rest before them. The city, wrapped in profound silence and night laden with death, was in the grip of yet a fiercer foe, the brigands. For breaking into habitations that were now mere charnel houses, they rifled the dead and stripped the coverings from bodies, and each victim expired with their eyes fixed on the temple and averted from the rebels whom he left alive. The latter, at the outset, ordered the bodies to be buried at public expense, finding the stench intolerable. Afterwards, when incapable of continuing this, they flung them from the ramparts into the ravines. As you can see, the Romans were experts at exacerbating human suffering. The passage in the slide is merely one of many accounts of suffering during the course of the siege of Jerusalem. Josephus's point was to highlight that the Jewish people did this to themselves by not accepting Roman rule. But in doing so, he actually relates how cruel Roman siege tactics were. Within this passage, people are starving to such an extent that they hope, and some even pray for death, that they pray that the thieves will actually do them the service of killing them. But according to Josephus, the thieves, in their infinite cruelty, make it a point not to kill those that ask for death. The idea of showing you this quote is to show you how much the people could suffer under a Roman siege, but also how descriptive Josephus gets when narrating certain events. He described the starved populace as, quote, like phantoms, and said that so great was the number of dead from this that people not only could not keep up with the funerary rites, but also did not have the strength to continue doing so. The only option available to them was to throw dead bodies over the wall into a ravine. In a following passage, Josephus tells us that Titus, on one of his perimeter walks, sees this pit of dead bodies and is so taken aback by the sight and by the smell that he prays to God to ensure God is aware that this was not his doing. This quote surmises how the Romans and even ancient warfare could and clearly would create conditions intent on worsening non-combatant suffering. I only mentioned some of the themes that appear, but here I will make them explicitly clear. Romans seem to express more emotions when they are discussing death against culturally normative means, tactics meant to deprive people of their needs, a negative sensory environment, and unconfrontable threats. The order doesn't matter, but the point remains that emotive language becomes more present when these themes appear. Sieges are most often fraught with these themes, especially all four of them. To briefly describe what these themes mean, death against culturally normative means is effectively a measure of how one might expect to die, or perhaps more importantly, how one would expect to witness death versus reality. Tactics that deprive people of their need augments the other themes as it can potentially weaken psychological resiliency. Jim Bradbury, a medieval historian, surmised of 6 elements to a siege. One was to starve a population. So it seems clear that siege warfare did not change from the Roman era into the medieval era. The pyramid on the screen under this theme is Maslow's hierarchy of needs and is intended to illustrate a theory which surmised that the basic needs that are essential to our lives, breathing, food, water, clothing even, are vital in supporting our psyche. It is at this foundation that the Romans attacked. The next theme is a bit broad, but most often involves sound and how sounds became another weapon by which ancient warfare used. Finally, unconfrontable threats also appear to psychologically affect soldiers, similar to some modern soldiers' experiences. Lionel Beener, a former siege warfare researcher from the Modern War Institute, wrote an article describing some aspects of the psychology behind sieges, though admittedly it did focus more on modern sieges. In it, Beener describes some characteristics congruent of my own research, and that sieges chip away at the normalcy of life. The foundations of the pyramid can rapidly crumble, and people's lives, physically, financially, and mentally, change over the course of a siege. This is the core of understanding psychological trauma in the Roman Empire. By following the cultural formulation from the DSM-5 TR, the aim was to understand the relationship between culture and trauma. Thus, these themes were born from that relationship. Ancient authors had some understanding of mental health, as they knew if they enacted either of these 4 themes, the enemy would be worse off. Though the sources never explicitly say that, they, for example, starved a populace to weaken their enemy's mind, Caesar's admission of the 4th category underpins the others. How does one adequately confront culturally non-normative death or need deprivation or negative sensory bombardment? In the passages, there was no real way to confront these threats. Caesar's soldiers could not confront the noise's origin. Josephus's men could not confront the siege weaponry. And the people of Jerusalem could not confront need deprivation in the face of Roman forces. By besieging a city, it meant not only breaking down walls, but also assaulting the very foundation of people's needs. This psychology lens allows us to view sieges in a way that is more conducive towards my goal of a holistic approach to trauma. In theory, the weaker their pyramid is, the lower their resilience is towards psychological damage, as psychological resiliency is more or less the product of the pyramid tier's safety and security and self-esteem, buttressed by love and belonging, and strengthened by self-actualization. My research focuses on utilizing a holistic approach towards viewing trauma that takes into account physical, emotional, and sensory experience, as well as memory. I have been systematically investigating sources utilizing the non-therapeutic aspect of the DSM-5-TR in order to better identify relevant aspects of culture that may relate to trauma. By doing so, we can understand the culture and context of Roman soldiers' lives, and though that cannot be thoroughly addressed in a presentation like this, I do hope that enough of a succinct preview was shown so we could identify through the sources shown some possible circumstances that may create traumatic memory. I hope that this presentation has demonstrated the value of a combined approach to understanding the experiences of men in the Roman army, using different methods of approaching traumatic experience from sensory experience, something of a new area in ancient history, but on which there is emerging research and work in the last few years from the scholars of the city of Rome, and emotional and other experiences. The research I presented has necessarily been contracted to fit this presentation so as to provide a few examples of how such an approach can be combined with a thorough and systematic analysis of textual material relating to military experience. I hope this has left you with a sense of the rich array of material on experiences of trauma in a very Roman context. And I'd welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. If you'd like to join us for the
Yes.
Q&A session. So, yes, if you have any questions either in the room, online, please let me know about them. I was going to take the chair's privilege and ask the first one, if that's okay, because you mentioned, Maslow and the DSM-5 and all the literature that we have now on psychology. Are there any hints that the Romans understand psychology, or is Caesar just employing tactics that they don't really understand the underlying foundations of?
There is some talk about mental health in the ancient world, and it seems clear that the Romans had an understanding of mental health, maybe not perhaps in the way that we understand mental health. If they had a book about injuries to the mind, it hasn't survived to this time. But it seems clear that they were very aware of mental injuries, as one of the state's responses was actually a medical discharge. And there is one mention about injuries to the mind. So it seems very clear that they were aware. But if some volume of mental health in the ancient world was written, it just hasn't survived.
Oh, that was going to be my other question, actually, is if you could have access to any body of sources to further your research. I know you're writing off your PhD at the moment, so hopefully it doesn't turn up. But say you do a postdoctoral fellowship, if any sort of source was to emerge, what would be your holy grail in terms of that?
The best thing would actually be a soldier's sort of journal from as early on as possible in their life, actually, to as late as possible. The problem with our sources and trying to understand their mental health is, like I mentioned, we only have snapshots of people's lives. So what happened to these men after the siege of Jerusalem? What was going on in their mind? And we just don't really know that. We have works from Josephus about his own life, but what was going on with everyday people who were, actually doing the besieging of a city, we just don't really have that.
Yeah. An interesting question from Chris Smith online. So he asks, if cruelty which affects the giver, I suppose is the best way of describing it, is that a matter of cultural norms? I'm thinking the differential here between what we see as a standard part of the Roman arsenal and something like Abu Ghraib, which is obviously a big scandal for modern military forces.
Yeah, I would say how people perceive something as being cruel is certainly rooted in cultural norms and cultural context. So something that if I'm reading a Roman source, and I'm always trying to look at this from a Roman perspective, of course I read a lot of things that I think are cruel, but are Romans considering this cruel? Are the people who are getting besieged considering this cruel? And I try to look at how the authors are describing the responses. So when Caesar denies the civilians departure, the civilians are crying and saying, please, we would rather go into slavery than be forced to get put through this. To me, that says that they think that this is cruel of Caesar to not do this. So it very much is rooted in the culture and the context of the passage.
I vaguely remember there being a certain amount of dispute over whether it was appropriate to reach back through time and try and diagnose people based on the evidence available. Is that something that you've come across in the context of this particular project?
Diagnosing people of the past.
Yeah, it was specifically medical issues. I forget the conference paper, but there was a fascinating conference paper where they looked at a particular individual and tried to work out what exactly was wrong with him. And I know obviously Abraham Lincoln, there have been a lot of post facto medical diagnoses. Is that backwards projection something that you struggle with in this case?
I avoid it completely. I think that there's too much research and too much literature in the medical field that says you shouldn't be diagnosing people who you can't have this conversation with. There are the most often talked about that I've come across in the medical field is when medical personnel are talking about diagnosing recently passed celebrities. They're not talking about ancient people, but they're talking about, whenever a celebrity passes away, there's some information that kind of comes out throughout the years that, oh, this person had this mental disorder, oh, this person had this, and it's a post-mortem diagnosis. And that's seen as somewhat okay because these people are born within this time and there are people who are alive that know them. But even still, the core of the DSM-5 TR is to actually have this conversation with someone to try to garner what are they saying? How are they describing their symptoms? And Romans can't do that. So I absolutely avoid saying Romans had PTSD because something like PTSD is rooted in our modern day culture.
Great. I've got another question from online, but is there anyone in the room that I'm missing out? The lights are fairly bright from here.
Yeah.
The question from we have one from David Hanson, which is who's the guy on the left, which if you're looking at the screen left, I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, I'm the research manager here. Welcome to the Royal Armouries. We have a question from Davina Duckworth. So did the Romans utilize a formal psychological warfare strategy, i.e. understanding the cultures they were fighting? And I was similarly curious about how much the Romans know about the cultures they're dealing with and what they consider culturally appropriate death.
So from Caesar, it seems clear that Caesar knew a lot, or at least he was being informed by people who knew a lot about the cultures of Gaul. We get a lot of discussion about how some tribes in Gaul are practice these sorts of things. These tribes in Gaul are less likely to work with the Romans because they're farther away from the Romans. So it seems clear that Caesar had a network of knowledge around Gaul, and he was governor of Gaul. So I think part of his responsibility was knowing some of this information. But it seems clear as well that he knew aspects of how to thwart them, but also aspects on what he knew he could probably lie to his Roman audience about. So one of the reasons why I suggest that if anyone is interested in reading about Julius Caesar, the landmark Julius Caesar has a lot of references and footnotes and provides a lot of context. So there's a siege in which the Romans tried to tunnel underneath the walls, which was not uncommon. And Caesar makes this claim that the Gallic people weren't good at making tunnels, but through the archaeological evidence, we know that that's not true. That they were very adept at there's actually a name for it, like counter mining. And we have archaeological evidence that proves Caesar wrong, that the Gallic people were very good. And you can sort of see this network of the Romans trying to counter the counter mining. And there's a series of counter. So it seems likely that Caesar knew what he could probably lie to the Roman audience about. But us in the modern world, because we have access to all of these resources, we know that he's lying.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that, I mean, we saw the Roman frontier in the map, but it's not a fixed impermeable frontier. There's a lot of trading that goes, so there will be amount of knowledge picked up as a result of that cross-cultural communication anyway.
Yes. So of course, the empire doesn't actually have clearly defined borders. Scholars over the years have just sort of determined that these approximate areas are where the empire ends. Um, Hilariously, Hadrian's Wall is one of the few formal uh, borders that we do have for the empire, but there's very obvious connections of trade stemming from huge swaths of the empire. So my research looks at this network of information trade. One of the specifics being how religious ideas were being transmitted from huge spans of space. There's a deity from Asia that makes its way all the way over here to Britain, and it has a pretty large following among soldiers. Um, his name is, so the Romans combined this deity with a deity that they already knew, and the deity's name was Jupiter Dolucanus. Dolucanus comes from Asia. So there are very clearly information networks and information trade going on. Of course, there's also physical trade going on. But there's been quite a bit of research done about how the empire was actually this information and material goods trade network that was sort of not only possible, but became more realistic with a huge centralized government running over it.
Another one from Chris Smith online, actually. So, and you possibly touched on it in the sense that Caesar is able to lie to an extent to his audience, but he's curious, is history written by the victors and made to make them look good or caring? I might even flip that and say, are they trying to make themselves look harsher on their enemies than they actually were?
So this is one of the core things about being a historian, is trying to determine whether someone is lying to you or not. And Caesar has been pretty well discussed, and he is still discussed, and he will probably continue to be discussed for generations about how Caesar's work is propaganda, how it's being influenced by whatever. And from Caesar's writings, it seems there are clear instances that we know that he is lying to us. And it also seems clear that he knew the boundaries he could push with these lies. But there is also a lot of truth to what he is saying. You know, he did try to tunnel under a Gallic wall. He did create a double wall around Alesia. There's a museum near Alesia, and I do not remember the modern name for it now, but it's this huge museum. I've seen pictures of it. It's very cool. But they talk a lot, and they have excavations, and they've actually reconstructed Caesar's double wall, and it's very, very cool. So we know what he is saying is true. But that's one of the biggest things about trying to investigate any part of history is this person telling us the truth? What is influencing their writing? And that's so central to a lot of historiography. The sort of good thing about my research is it almost, and I say this very cautiously, please do not quote me, it almost doesn't matter how truthful or how much someone is lying to me whenever I'm reading this. The fact that they're conceptualizing something like this is enough for me to say, so even if this is a pure fabrication, they knew that this was a possibility, they conceptualized it, and they're talking about it, which is also why I think plays and other literary works like that are also valid for something like this, is people are conceptualizing this trauma happening.
Fantastic. So that brings us pretty much to the end of the time we have available. Lovely. Chris Smith has dropped a link to the museum, which I will put into the chat for everyone on Zoom, just so you can go. Nice. Lovely. So yes, so thank you to Adam for today's talk. If people do happen to want to find out more, either about your work or about this topic in general, where might they go?
So research over psychological trauma in the Roman Empire is, whenever I started my PhD in 2021, there was two articles that specifically and very well talked about psychological trauma in the Roman Empire. Now that I'm almost at the end, there's been a decent amount of Roman evidence coming up. So there's been a lot of discussion about the Greek world. But there hasn't really been a lot of Roman. But over the past couple of years, people have been researching more and more about the Roman world. So if you want to know more, there's a really good article by Aslan Melkor, whose research focuses on specifically Caesar and psychological trauma. There are a lot of books about psychological trauma in the Greek world. And then a very recent book came out, Combat Trauma in Pre-Modern Europe came out. And it was actually edited by three Manchester Metropolitan scholars. That's a very, very good book. And it's not just ancient history, but it's history up until the pre-modern world. So it covers multiple eras throughout time. Otherwise, they're more than welcome to email me, and I think I put my email at the end of the slide.
Yes, yes.
Perfect.
And you're not on Twitter or anything like that, or X, as I think we should.
No, not really.
Very, very sensible
Yeah.
PhD student. It can swallow up massive amounts of your research. But yes, so I'll do it. But that covers our talk today. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Adam.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you.
And just very quickly, thank you also to Laurie and James from our AV team for managing the event on the day. And thank you to Katie, who is somewhere behind the scenes managing the feed to YouTube. But most of all, thank you to you in the audience, whether you're live or virtual, for attending, for your questions, comments, and engagement. We would very much like to know how you think about this, both about this event and future events in the series. There are links to the survey in the closing slides. Please do let us know. Our next talk is in 2 weeks' time and takes us to the medieval Middle East, where Thomas Brissett of the University of Lancaster will explore sieges of the 12th century. For details of this talk and all the others in our future series, go to our website, which is royalarmouries.org, follow us on Eventbrite or the other social medias of your choice. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.